Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into a really critical analysis from Professor Rainer Mausfeld, specifically looking at his lecture, Why Do the Lambs Fall Silent? We're aiming to unpack his core arguments about, well, power, fear, and how they shape society.
That's right. Mausfeld starts by tackling something quite fundamental, this old metaphor of the herd and the shepherd.
Yes, it seems so ingrained in Western political thought. The shepherd seems like a caring figure.
Exactly. Comforting, almost. But Mausfeld really peels back that layer. He argues the shepherd isn't actually concerned with the sheep's well-being.
Right, the loyalty is to the owner of the sheep.
Mhm.
And the owner is sort of invisible in that picture.
Precisely. And Mausfeld contends this isn't just some oversight, it's a framing designed to prop up elite power and push this idea of an immature people needing control.
So it justifies their rule in a sense.
It does. And this leads into Mausfeld's central thesis, which is, I think, the real core of what we need to discuss. He argues that generating fear isn't accidental.
Not a byproduct.
No, not at all. He calls it a Herrschaftstechnik, a technology of rule, ancient, deliberate, used by a small minority to control the majority.
Wow, a technology. He sees it that consciously applied.
Yes, and he points back to historians like Polybius, who basically said, the masses are volatile, irrational.
And therefore need to be kept in line using diffuse fear and terror. That's quite a statement.
It is. It suggests this isn't a modern invention, but maybe something inherent in hierarchical power structures.
Okay, so if fear is this deliberate tool, what does that mean for democracy? Because the Enlightenment idea was about minimizing fear, wasn't it? Empowering the individual, self-determination.
Right. Less social anxiety, more internal peace. But from the perspective of ruling elites, Mausfeld argues true democracy is actually a problem.
Because it limits their ability to use that fear tool.
Exactly. So you get this paradox Mausfeld explores. How can democracy, which we see as the only legitimate system, coexist with elites who find it, well, inconvenient?
That's a fascinating tension. How does he unpack that?
Well, he makes a really crucial distinction between two types of fear. This is key to his analysis: Furcht and angst.
Okay, Furcht and Angst, German terms.
Yes, Furcht is concrete fear. It's directed at something specific, something identifiable. Think of a grizzly bear charging at you.
You see the threat, you know what to do or what to try to do. It's actionable.
Precisely. You can identify it, react to it. But angst is different. It's diffuse, it's neurotic. It doesn't have a clear object.
So it's just a general feeling of anxiety.
Right, and because it's objectless, it's paralyzing, it turns inward. Mausfeld argues this is far more insidious, far more useful for control.
How does he see that manifesting in
Yeah.
society, I mean?
He gives several examples. The loss of privacy through surveillance, this feeling of psychological fragmentation, losing your sense of identity, the breakdown of social bonds leading to atomization.
And those chronic worries about the future, the constant pressure to be flexible, adapt.
All of it contributes. It creates this pervasive feeling of powerlessness, this sort of background hum of anxiety.
Okay, so Furcht is direct, angst is diffuse. And Mausfeld argues angst is the politically useful one.
That's his core point here. The technique of power, as he sees it, is to take legitimate, concrete fears, Furcht, and transform them into this paralyzing, objectless angst.
Can you give an example of that transformation?
Well, he cites a political scientist like John Mearheimer, noting how fear generation has been central to, say, U.S. foreign policy for decades.
Right. And Mausfeld uses that chilling example. The vial, supposedly evidence of WMDs.
Exactly. That image, he argues, wasn't about presenting concrete proof. It was about manufacturing angst on a massive scale. Enough fear to, as he puts it, lay waste countries with millions of dead.
So you create the diffuse fear and then you provide an object for it.
You provide an object for the hatred that the fear generates. Mausfeld references Harold Lasswell here, an early communication researcher.
Lasswell's point being,
There must be no ambiguity about who the public is to hate. You channel all that psychological energy, that angst, away from the real power centers.
and onto some external target, often an abstract one.
Precisely. It distracts. It prevents people from questioning the source of their unease.
Which brings us to how Mausfeld sees this playing out in contemporary systems, particularly what he terms the neoliberal project.
Yes, he argues that while real democracy aims to minimize fear, neoliberalism actively generates it, systematically.
How so? What are the mechanisms?
Firstly, through promoting what he calls social precarity. the instability of work, the constant threat of job loss.
He even quotes real politicers admitting that the permanent fear of job loss is half the battle for securing rule.
Right. It creates a sense of powerlessness against these seemingly vast, unaccountable market forces. The ideology itself suggests the social world is too complex, uncontrollable.
Except for the free market, which is presented as this rational but untouchable entity.
Exactly. It breeds this deep insecurity. That's the first mechanism.
Second.
The use of soft power techniques. Mausfeld draws on work like Nye's on soft power,
Right.
but also Thaler and Sunstein's nudge.
Nudge theory, influencing choices subtly.
In essence, yes. He sees these as forms of psychological manipulation, almost warfare against the population. They exploit our cognitive biases.
The fact that we aren't always perfectly rational.
Right, to subtly nudge people in desired directions, often without them even realizing it. It goes back to Laswell again, really. Opinion management is cheaper than violence.
Bribery or any other control technique, and these operate through media, education, culture, often invisibly.
Then there's a third mechanism Mausfeld highlights. It's more ideological.
Which is?
The deliberate framing that equates popular sovereignty rule by the people with elite rule, creating this stark division.
Between the elites, supposedly rational, educated, and the masses, supposedly irrational, emotional, childish.
Yes, he quotes Frederick II of Prussia calling commoners animals, fools, stuck in prejudice.
And that old Prussian Academy question, is it useful to deceive the people?
A third apparently thought yes, fearing chaos if the truth got out. Mausfeld connects this historical attitude directly to today, asserting that lying is just part of the political game now.
He cites Jean-Claude Juncker's quote, "When it gets serious, you have to lie." Quite blunt.
Very blunt. And this ties into what Mausfeld calls the Kampf gegen X, the fight against X.
Ah, yes, the creation of abstract enemies.
Exactly. These X's are deliberately vague. Terror, disinformation, fake news, even something like right-wing populism used broadly.
The vagueness is the point, isn't it?
Mausfeld argues it is. Quoting another analyst, Kruinski, the very indefiniteness is intended. Constantly talking about a war on terror, for instance, fosters that culture of fear.
And that culture darkens reason, intensifies emotions, making people easier to mobilize for certain policies.
Precisely. It diverts attention. He gives historical examples, the greedy welfare state, the demonization of refugees.
He mentions the term assailant in Germany being specifically coined as a pejorative.
Yes, to fuel anti-immigrant sentiment. And he connects this to a deeper argument about globalized capitalism needing structural racism to justify inequality. Citing Wallerstein here.
So, fear-mongering and racism used to distract from massive wealth redistribution upwards over decades.
That's Mausfeld's argument. He also points to things like digital manipulation and coordinated media campaigns as state-organized efforts to control narratives, often escaping real public scrutiny.
Okay, so we have this system generating diffuse fear, channeling anger towards abstract enemies. What are the consequences for society, according to Mausfeld?
He outlines several profound consequences. First, widespread political apathy. Lethargy.
People just checking out.
Yes. He notes that some theorists of elite democracy actually aimed for this, keeping the public passive.
Yeah.
He cites Hannah Arendt on totalitarian education, destroying the capacity to form convictions, not just instilling wrong ones.
So it shuts down engagement. What else?
Secondly, diminished empathy and the demonization of the other. Racism, as we discussed, becomes a tool to stabilize exploitation.
Diverting anger away from the real power structures again.
Exactly. And thirdly, Mausfeld warns quite strongly about an authoritarian turn. The executive branch, the government increasingly freeing itself from democratic checks and balances, using the climate of fear as justification.
He gives the example of the Gefährder or threatener category in German law.
Yes, allowing potentially indefinite detention without full judicial process. He calls it a refeudalization of justice, a step back towards arbitrary power.
And this authoritarian turn, for Mausfeld, it enables undemocratic decisions to be pushed through.
That's the connection he makes. Things like huge tax cuts for the wealthy or massive bank bailouts, policies that might face huge opposition normally.
But by manipulating fear, redirecting attention with these fight against X campaigns, they get pushed through.
And the real centers of economic power, which often translate into political power, become almost invisible. He cites Jeffrey Sachs on how just a few lobbies can dominate the U.S. political system.
It sounds like Mausfeld views neoliberalism itself in a very harsh light.
Extremely harsh. He goes so far as to call it a totalitarian ideology in some respect.
Totalitarian, that's a strong claim. What similarities does he see?
He points to a shared contempt for what 1789 represents the Enlightenment ideals of human rights, equality, real democracy. Also a kind of social Darwinism and deep contempt for ordinary people.
And he argues it aims to reshape individuals.
Yes, into just consumers or fragmented bundles of competence, dissolving the core of the self that could resist or think critically.
He also talks about deep indoctrination, doesn't he? Typhon indoctrination.
Two powerful forms, yes. The first is the ideology of the benevolent empire, particularly regarding the U.S.
The idea that the U.S. is fundamentally a force for good globally.
Right. Mausfeld argues this narrative, despite historical complexities, was systematically built after World War II, becoming almost unquestionable, a self-evident truth.
He contrasts the public rhetoric with internal documents, like that Kennan memo from 1948.
Exactly. Kennan basically advising ditching sentimentality about human rights and democracy for sober power thinking to maintain U.S. dominance and wealth disparity.
Quite a contrast to the rhetoric about being the greatest force for peace and freedom.
Mausfeld highlights the sheer scale of U.S. military spending and its global base network as evidence of what he calls full-spectrum dominance. A hegemonic project, not benevolence.
Okay, that's the first deep indoctrination. What's the second?
The widespread belief that representative democracy, especially the American Federalist model, is the best or even the only viable form of democracy.
He sees that as indoctrination, too.
He does. He argues this model was historically novel and effectively meant people giving up direct political power.
And he points to studies, like by Gillens and Page.
Yes, studies suggesting average citizens in the U.S. have almost zero influence on policy, leading Mausfeld to conclude the U.S. functions more like an elite electoral oligarchy.
Which brings him to that stark conclusion. Capitalist democracy is almost a contradiction in terms.
Because in his view, capitalism inherently produces the fear and inequality that undermine genuine democratic self-determination.
Wow. That's a heavy critique. So after laying all this out, the fear mechanisms, the consequences, the indoctrination, what's the way out? What's Mausfeld's proposed antidote?
Well, it's not a simple fix. He calls for a radical re-democratization of society.
Meaning more than just voting.
Much more. It means fundamentally changing the relationship between the economy and society, embedding the economy within social and democratic control, not the other way around.
Reversing the neoliberal model where society serves the economy?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And restoring a strict separation of powers. Critically, demanding that all power structures, economic, media, political projection, justify their existence and are accountable to the public.
If they can't justify themselves democratically, they're illegitimate in his view.
That's his stance. And the final crucial piece is about narrative.
Changing the story.
Exactly. He stresses the vital need to create compelling alternative narratives, Deutungsrahmen, interpretive frameworks.
Narratives that offer hope, a path forward.
Yes, hope and a vision for constructive change, something to directly counter the paralyzing narratives of fear and powerlessness. He calls for a return to the core principles of the radical Enlightenment.
Freeing the mind, mature citizens, universal morality, democratic accountability for all power.
Those transformative ideas.
Yeah.
But Mausfeld soberly notes they've been suppressed, forgotten, through decades of elite-driven messaging.
To the point where sometimes, he observes, populist movements offer narratives that seem more plausible to people feeling lost or anxious.
Which presents a real challenge, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It highlights the scale of the task. Mausfeld's conclusion is quite direct, isn't it?
Yes. He argues the energy for this kind of fundamental change can only come from below, from us.
It's our task, our responsibility.
That's the call to action.
Well, we've definitely covered some complex and frankly unsettling ground today exploring Professor Mausfeld's analysis. His work really pushes us to look critically at power and how our own views might be shaped.
Absolutely. I think understanding these mechanisms, fear, ideology, soft power, it's really the essential first step towards any kind of meaningful critical thinking or civic engagement today.
So maybe the thought to leave you with, drawing from Mausfeld, is this. If these control mechanisms have become so subtle, almost invisible, woven into our daily lives, how do we even start to recognize them?
And perhaps, more importantly, what small concrete steps can each of us take to push back, to reclaim that space for independent thought and action?
What stood out most to you from this deep dive today? We definitely encourage you to keep reflecting and exploring these ideas.